This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. The lights are turned on at a regular time the next morning, and the players awaken from their slumber to see new food packages being distributed by circle guards. Several players remain in their beds to consume the contents of their packages, but some get to their feet. A few chat, with a somewhat lighter or lazier tone compared to previous days. After a few minutes, an announcement from Mr. Orange informs players to eat up, as they have just 1 hour until the next game begins. Diane, player 96, is still lying naked in her bed within the arms of Steve, player 98. She has dragged the bedsheet just high enough to cover her closed eyes from the bright lights above. Despite being constricted by the limited space of a single bed, Steve does not seem uncomfortable and gently runs his fingers through Diane's blonde hair. Noticing her stirring, he mouths "wakey wakey" into her ear. She does not open her eyes or even make the effort to use her voice, but lets out a dazed, tranquil hum instead. Steve kisses the nape of Diane's neck, then runs his hand firmly down the side of her body. She lets out a relaxed breath and pulls back the sheet from over her eyes, which causes her to squint at the light from above. A few seconds later, Silver, player 71, walks past in nothing but a pair of grey knickers, with a towel traipsed over her breasts. She catches Diane's eye and grins as she walks past. Steve chuckles quietly, although Diane simply lies back with a calm smile. Steve lets out a deep breath and announces he's hungry. He rolls away from Diane and feels for his boxes on the floor. However, when he finds them, Diane turns back and asks him to wait. Steve asks why, and Diane answers how she just wants to lie here with him for a few minutes. He turns back with a blank expression, but gradually nods and smiles, dropping his underwear back to the floor as he turns to hold Diane in his arms. The couple do not say a word, with Diane nestling her head in Steve's shoulder, whilst he looks out into the dormitory, slowly falling into a deep thought. Almost a minute later, a severe and painful coughing is heard from the front of the dormitory. Diane jerks up and frowns, letting the sheet drop from over her breasts. On his way back from the front of the dormitory, Johnny, player 123, stops in his tracks and stares at Diane's bare chest, but she ignores him. Steve comments how someone sounds ill, and Diane responds with a tone of concern that it's Alan, player 23. She shoves on her bra and knickers, and Steve asks what she's doing. She gets out of bed and responds that someone should check on him. At the front of the dormitory, Alan is coughing out phlegm from deep in his lungs, to the point that he is struggling to breathe and nearly retching. Gathering a quick breath between coughs, he leans forward to the pack at the end of his bed, but fails to reach far enough, and his coughing recommences. Diane walks in at this moment and stops next to Alan's bed. She frowns and asks if he's okay, at a volume which is barely audible over the sound of his painful rasps for breath. A second later, he manages to point a pale finger at the package by the foot of his bed, which Diane passes over. His coughing briefly pauses, and he thrusts a hand into the pack, from which he pulls out a bottle of water. Alan proceeds to drink with some intensity, and Diane looks down to his bed. She observes that his sweating skin is practically stuck to the bedsheet, which is now a light shade of yellow. After a few more breaths and swigs of water, Alan finally looks Diane in the eye. He exclaims how fucking rough he feels, then laments that he must have the flu again. Diane asks if he is going to see a doctor. He looks up to her with a bewildered expression, and just when she realizes the impossibility of this task, a circle guard walks past. Richard, player 14, who has been quietly watching from his bed, shouts at the guard that they need to quarantine this Nancy, as he is properly ill this time, and will make the rest of them ill too. The guard stops, and Diane shouts at Richard to shut the fuck up, then she expresses her hope that he gets ill as well. Whilst Alan launches into another coughing fit, Richard begins to argue with Diane and the guard continues watching. The conflict intensifies, and Diane soon looks ready to storm towards Richard. However, instead of moving, she finds herself biting her lip and turning to the guard. She forcefully affirms that she does not want to spend what could be the last day of her life dealing with this bullshit, and asks if there is a doctor around or anyone who can give Alan some antibiotics. He appears exhausted after having just swallowed a mouthful of water. In a daze, he wipes the dirty sheet on his forehead and Diane comments that he is obviously under the weather. Alan shoots the guard a begging glance of fatigue, but Richard shouts how unfair this is, arguing that everyone is a bit under the weather. With a look of pure impatience, Diane snaps to keep his stupid, ugly nose out of it. Richard fires back that he has had a cold for a few days now, and it is unfair for one of them to get medication and not the rest of them. Diane glares back to Richard, but seems unable to argue this point. Richard is about to speak again when Tracy, player 26, who has been watching from her bed since the argument began, declares that nobody is this deep under the weather, and nods to Alan. Pointing a finger to the prize fund of £13,500,000 on the screen, Tracy walks over and asks the guard if the person footing this bill is not expecting a good show. Diane and Richard seem equally perplexed by Tracy's point, but she reasons that whoever this is will not get the show they've paid for from someone in this condition. Tracy finishes this sentence after turning her finger to point to Alan, who is now quietly spitting out more from his lungs. She then justifies to the guard how if they give him some medicine, he might at least feel well enough to do something interesting in the next game. Although Alan appears more focused on ingesting as much water as he can, Diane looks towards Tracy with an expression of surprised hope. Richard begins to complain when the guard interrupts, telling Tracy that he will see what he can do, before turning and heading to the front doors. Diane shoots a smug smile at Richard, who grumbles to himself as he walks off. Alan nods with appreciation to Tracy, and she stoically thanks him for the chocolate bar last night. Alan croaks how he forgot about it. With a meagre smile, Tracy responds that she did not. As Tracy returns to her bed, Diane sits with Alan and asks if he will have a shower or eat something. He looks up with tired eyes and answers that he's not hungry. Diane seems unsure of what to say and looks around, seemingly for guidance, until Alan hoists himself out of bed and asks her to pass his towel. Stood by his bed at the back of the dormitory, Nicholas, player 173, has been trying to comprehend this altercation between Diane and Richard. As the front of the dormitory resettles, he stretches his arms out, feeling several clicks along his back. Nicholas swigs from his bottle and looks ahead, but soon turns his attention to the conversation occurring behind him. He then hears Kelly, player 189, tell Charlie, player 191, how if she wins, she will travel the world and try to forget about everything that's happened here. Charlie nods in agreement, but Kelly adds that she would also give some money to a panda charity. Charlie laughs and asks why, to which Kelly gives a bittersweet smile and gestures to the empty bed of Scott, player 197, explaining how they were his favourite animal. Nicholas spends the next minute focused on eating a bacon sandwich in one hand, whilst cracking the knuckles of his other hand. When both processes are complete, he turns his attention back to Kelly and Charlie, to hear the latter recall how his bitch ex-missus has not let him see his son for over a year. Nicholas's eyebrows rise, and Kelly frowns, asking, "Bitch ex-missus?" Charlie sighs with a grin, then after a few thoughtful seconds, admits that maybe she wasn't a complete bitch. He explains how she had an issue with him spending most of his time with his pals before they broke up, then moving in with them after. He adds that whenever she came round to pick up their son, she would complain about the state of the house, or about how much time he and his friends had spent playing Nintendo with his son. With an intrigued grin, Kelly asks Charlie if he blames her for having an issue with this. He does not answer this question, but claims that if he wins, he will buy his own place, somewhere nice enough that his ex would let their son stay, and he will actually pull a finger out and take his son places. Kelly smiles sympathetically, and with a conceding nod of the head, Charlie admits how maybe his ex is right about him needing to grow up, given that he is supposed to turn 30 in 2 weeks. Kelly exclaims that of course Charlie is a Sagittarius. He rolls his eyes round to her, and with a dim expression, asks if she believes in that horse shirt. Still listening to this conversation, Nicholas discreetly turns towards them. He sees Kelly give a cautious nod, and asks how anyone could prove star signs to be wrong. Charlie shakes his head with a grin, and asks how this place can get any worse. As Kelly manages a light laugh, player 200, the young woman with a short auburn perm, gets up from her bed, and comments that everyone she knows with children seems to base their lives around them, and she herself would never have the patience. Kelly frowns behind player 200's back, but Charlie responds with a smile that he was fucking gutted when his missus told him she was pregnant, although this went out the window the second he held his son for the first time. In the gallery, Squareguard is continuing his sketch of Van Gogh's Café Terrace at night upon an easel which overlooks the dormitory. After he pencils in the last of the stars, a knock is heard at the door. Squareguard clears his throat and orders the knocker to come in. The 3 triangle guards enter, and without looking away from his painting, Squareguard instructs them to get a drink and take their seats. Whilst Mr. Yellow takes a seat at the table and flicks through his copy of the updated player booklet, Mr. Orange and Miss Green head to the bar and help themselves to some soft drinks. After taking a straw and beginning to sip, Miss Green approaches the surveillance screens and observes the scenes throughout the dormitory. This is until Mr. Orange nudges Miss Green and gestures to Mr. Yellow, who is now navigating a finger between the statistics for Richard and Alan. Miss Green looks over, and Mr. Orange quietly jokes about Mr. Yellow being a nerd. Miss Green does not react. Instead, she walks ahead and takes a seat at the table next to Mr. Yellow. Mr. Orange reluctantly follows her and sits on the other side of Mr. Yellow. He tries to gain Miss Green's attention, but she proceeds to open her own player booklet. A moment later, Squareguard turns from his easel and thanks the guards for waiting. He sits across from them and begins the meeting by informing how the investigation into Mrs. Blue's death is still ongoing, with all circle guards who are active in this game being interviewed by the powers that be over the course of this morning. Mr. Orange interrupts that he thought everything was sorted out, but Squareguard holds up a hand and affirms he cannot share any further details at this time. Mr. Yellow and Miss Green both look to Mr. Orange, and Squareguard continues that back to today, everything is now set and ready for the 5th game. He confidently informs how the building has been secured and the board is ready for action, adding that some of the guards even had a practice game this morning. Mr. Yellow cocks his head in surprise, to which Squareguard assures how this was of course at base level. Mr. Yellow nods, and Squareguard is about to continue, when he tuts in annoyance and gets up to grab a piece of paper from a stall in the corner. Mr. Orange sniggers as Squareguard walks back. Once he has sat back in his seat, he proceeds to announce that he has made an important decision. After a silent pause, he informs the triangle guards how although he previously decided to assign them individual roles for each section of today's game, he has changed his mind, and they will instead be leading the whole game between them. Mr. Orange raises his hands in passive annoyance, but Squareguard explains that the triangle guards will need to decide how they will introduce the game, set players' turns, and of course decide when a player may have broken the rules if this player is still on the board. Mr. Orange turns to Miss Green, and Squareguard declares how although this change of plans may come as a surprise, he will make no apologies, adding that spontaneity is something he values. While Mr. Yellow nods, Miss Green raises her hand and states that there are still 17 players. She then claims how she does not want to sound like someone else, nodding to Mrs. Blue's seat, but this is an odd number of players, so one of the sides will be more bunched up than the other. Squareguard begins to speak, when Mr. Orange interrupts that he thought of this earlier, and demands to know if one of the players needs to leave before the game, in order to even things out. After a moment of thoughtful silence, Squareguard simply answers how it is for the 3 of them to decide how to resolve this issue. Mr. Orange shouts over once more, but this time Squareguard forcefully talks over him, declaring that he needs to stop interrupting and listen to other people. Mr. Orange lets out a shocked chuckle, although Squareguard insists he is being serious. Mr. Yellow gives a gentle nod to Squareguard, who clears his throat before advising that they should aim to agree on whichever decision they make. Mr. Orange scoffs, then gets up and mutters to himself in anger as he storms out of the gallery. After watching him leave, Squareguard turns back and asks if there are any questions. A minute later, Mr. Yellow and Miss Green enter the dormitory and look out from the front platform. The former suggests they speak with Mr. Orange before the game, in order to sort out the 17 issue. Miss Green responds that it might be a bit late for this now. She then gestures to Mr. Orange, who is walking slowly along the right side of the dormitory. Miss Green proceeds to head through the left of the dormitory, on the opposite side to Mr. Orange. Mr. Yellow remains upon the platform and surveys the nearest players as they continue to eat and talk amongst themselves. A minute later, a circle guard enters through the front doors with a cup of small white pills. Some players appear intrigued when they see these pills being delivered to Alan. However, before the guard can leave, player 35, the woman with gaping eyes and a smattering of tattoos, marches over and demands to know where her sandwich is. While listening to the guard trying to calm player 35, Alan forces himself to sit up in bed, and after a quick futile examination of the pills, he sees them down with all the water left in his bottle. Miss Green comes to a stop by the bed of player 102. She appears to contemplate her actions, before turning and lying back on this bed. Diane is resting on her own in the adjacent row. She looks over with a quick frown at the sight of Miss Green lying on the bed, but says nothing and continues eating the contents of her pack. After letting out a deep breath, Miss Green hears a voice ask why she's lying on a player's bed. She looks up to see Mr. Orange, and before she can answer his first question, he asks why she's being funny with him. Miss Green responds that she is not being funny with him, but is just a bit on edge after what happened on the beach. She then whispers how even though they did what needed to be done, killing people is not exactly something she does for fun. Mr. Orange asks what Miss Green means. She does not answer, but continues that she was having a think during the night, which helped her remember how only one of them is going to get this position. Responding that the salary is still pretty good, Mr. Orange goes to sit on the bed with Miss Green, but she gets up and replies how she doesn't want to go back to the real world. After a brief pause, he asks what she means. For a moment, Miss Green seems tongue-tied, until she blurts out how even though they've had a good time together, this won't be able to continue, which she says as she points between herself and Mr. Orange. He shrugs in denial, until Miss Green quietly snaps that they were almost caught together. Mr. Orange sighs that they can work together and still have fun, but Miss Green gets up from the bed. She is about to walk away when Mr. Orange claims she is making the wrong decision and asks if she's sure. Miss Green faces him for a second, then turns away with an audible sigh and walks on. Mr. Orange seems lost for words, and his hands form into fists when Miss Green suddenly turns back. She points to the screen and states that the priority right now is to sort that. Mr. Orange looks up to see 17 players remaining. Miss Green says she needs to think and marches onwards to the back of the dormitory, straight past player 132, the middle-aged man with bushy eyebrows, and Johnny, who sits on his bed and sniggers as he tucks into a sausage sandwich. A moment later, player 132 catches Johnny's attention and points with a knowing smile towards Miss Green's bottom. He chortles, and she comes to a stop just meters away. As Miss Green turns round, player 132 stops gesturing to her with his hands, but not quickly enough to stop her from seeing his actions. Player 127, the older West African man, who has been resting his injured knee, looks up in trepidation. With Miss Green now facing this group, player 132 stumbles to excuse himself, adding with a smile that he would never actually try anything. After a silent moment, he hastens to add how this is unless she wanted him to. Johnny continues cringing towards player 132, who hurries to explain himself once again, but Miss Green hastily turns away, taking deep breaths as she begins to march onwards. When Miss Green reaches the bed of player 152, she stops and scratches her fingernails over the hood of her jumpsuit. She proceeds to breathe out when a voice behind her declares how she should really do something about that. Miss Green whips round and snaps at Mr. Orange to stop sneaking up on her. He apologizes, yet slowly approaches her. She could be heard breathing in deeply and does not step back, allowing Mr. Orange to move even closer until they are almost touching. With an air of annoyance, Miss Green asks what Mr. Orange is doing. He hushes her and discreetly removes a knife from his pocket, away from the view of any players. Miss Green flinches at this sight, but allows Mr. Orange to place the knife in her pocket, which causes her to gasp a little beneath her mask. Mr. Orange then leans further forward and whispers into Miss Green's ear that this git is undressing her with his eyes as they speak. Miss Green looks back, and player 132 abruptly twists away. Mr. Orange steps forward, takes her into his arms, and whispers that sometimes you have to use your power to do what is right. Miss Green takes a deep breath, and a moment later, she whips round, then walks straight towards player 132 and Johnny. However, they both seem surprised when she passes them without a word. Player 132 lets his eyes follow Miss Green, who begins to elongate her strides and roll her hips in a somewhat exaggerated manner as she walks on. When she is just a few meters ahead, she unzips the front of her jumpsuit and lets her player booklet drop out to the floor. She lets out an exaggerated gasp of annoyance. While slowly bending down to collect the booklet, she looks between her legs to see player 132 ogling her body once more. Miss Green gently stands back upright and turns to see player 132 still eyeing her. A smile forms across his face, and he seems unwilling to turn away. Miss Green walks back and approaches player 132. He appears pleasantly surprised, but even more so when she stops just in front of him and whispers, "Fuck it, take me now." Although player 132 frowns, Miss Green sighs how life is too short. Many players look over in surprise as he pulls her towards him. Her body remains limp, and he utters that today must be his birthday. Player 132 takes Miss Green into his arms, then runs his hand down to her bottom. She giggles lightly and whispers how it's the complete opposite of his birthday. Player 132 asks what Miss Green means. Without delay, she pulls out the knife from her pocket and slices it across his throat. Blood splatters out and several nearby players shout or scream as player 132 falls to the floor, gargling for bloodied breath and gripping his hands to his neck. Johnny swears in disbelief and backs away, almost tripping over his bed, whilst player 127 signs the cross over his chest. Within seconds, every player and guard is watching with undivided attention. Wiping some of player 132's blood from her mask, Miss Green stands over him and calmly reminds how life is indeed too short. Miss Green takes out her screen device from her pocket, and after pressing a few buttons, her voice booms out from the speakers, declaring that the stage is set for the next game. This does not gain much of a reaction from any players, most of whom are still watching in shock, although several guards nod or communicate into their radios. Miss Green looks up to the screen, and the number of players remaining decreases to 16, while the prize fund increases to £13,600,000. Miss Green barks, "Are you being serious?" into her radio. A moment later, the prize fund falls back to £13,500,000. Soon after, a set of circle guards come through the front doors with a stretcher. As the players cautiously return to their earlier activities, Mr. Orange approaches Miss Green and affirms how she is lucky he still cares about her. She lets out a drained laugh and holds out the bloody knife for him to take back, admitting that she is so tired of this shirt. Mr. Orange takes the knife back and wipes it on the nearest bedsheet. He says he needs to use the loo before the game and excuses himself, heading back to the front of the dormitory. When he reaches the front doors, Mr. Yellow paces over and demands to know why he and Miss Green just murdered a player for no reason. Mr. Orange stops and declares it was Green and that she completely freaked out. He points back to her as she rests on the bed of player 152 and frantically claims he did not realise what she was going to do until it was too late. Mr. Yellow seems too shocked to respond, and Mr. Orange adds, however, that on a positive note, their odd number issue has been sorted. Just over 10 minutes later, the 16 remaining players are ordered to gather at the front of the dormitory. From here, they are placed into 4 groups of 4, by order of their numbers. Within minutes, a convoy of 4 trucks is driving the 16 players along a gravelled road, lined with overgrown grass and bushy trees. In the front truck, Richard covers his mouth with his jacket and nestles himself in the furthest corner from Alan, who is still sweating a little, although his skin is regaining its colour and he seems more alert than he was prior to consuming the pills. Just when the truck turns a corner, Alan lets out a cracking cough beneath his t-shirt, and Richard growls how he should have been made to walk. Tracy suddenly blurts out at Richard to be quiet. He looks to player 35, then jabs a finger at Tracy and asks who put 10 pence in the dosser. Tracy apologises to Richard for shouting at him, but claims she is nervous. Before he can respond, the non-driving guard shouts into the back of the truck, ordering silence from all players. Richard and Tracy proceed to fall silent, although player 35 lets out a loud, sudden giggle, which causes Richard to jump and look at her in disbelief. In the truck behind them, Silver is quietly crying. Player 53, the woman with the blonde quiff and chunky glasses, is sat across, yet she does nothing to comfort her and stares out the back of the truck. Diane gives Silver a minorly hopeful smile, but this does not seem to lighten her spirits. A minute later, their driving guard opens a window, which introduces a cold winter breeze through the truck, and Silver's crying is soon accompanied by the chattering of her teeth. Colin reassuringly puts out a hand towards her. She seems bewildered, although after looking up to see his sympathetic look, finds herself gripping onto his hand in return. The truck behind, containing Steve, Johnny, player 127, the older West African man, and Lakshmi, player 148, is by far the quietest, with barely anything said between them throughout this journey. In fact, they face ahead and appear to purposefully avoid eye contact with each other. In the last of the 4 trucks, Nicholas and player 200 remain silent, but listen into a conversation between Charlie and Kelly, in which they discuss which game they could be about to face and the strategies which might work for any of these games. After a journey of almost 10 minutes, the trucks enter a gravelled clearing. A narrow, yet extremely tall building stands at the centre and towers over its surroundings. This enormous structure is shaped by metallic outer walls, albeit with no windows. The trucks park before this building, and the circle guards subsequently disembark. Some players lift the tarpaulins, preparing to disembark as well, but the guards order them to stay in the trucks, and the tarpaulins are lowered back down. Most players wait nervously, and a few try to fill the silence with idle conversation, until they hear another truck pulling up. Several sets of footsteps are heard moving away from this truck, followed by an argument between Miss Green and Mr. Orange regarding the starting positions of players in the game they are about to play. Whilst a circle guard swiftly approaches the triangle guards, Miss Green is heard shouting that players with larger height differences should not be placed together, as this is not fair. However, Mr. Orange fires back how life is not fair, and they should be placed wherever they can provide the best show. This argument continues for almost another minute, until Mr. Yellow steps down from the truck and gently interrupts. After finally catching Miss Green and Mr. Orange's attention, he shows them a list he has just created, displaying a new set of potential starting positions. Following a brief examination, Miss Green is heard giving a somewhat surprised sound of approval. She makes just one switch of players, then responds that she would be willing to use Mr. Yellow's list. The circle guard waits for acknowledgement as Mr. Orange takes a little longer to examine this list, but after a quick swap of two sets of positions, he also gives his approval and announces how this game is going to be cracking if they can pull it off. He clicks his fingers at the circle guard and informs how the starting positions are finalised, before inquiring if the players are still in the waiting room or already at base level. The circle guard gestures to the trucks behind them and answers that the players are still waiting inside. Mr. Orange lets out a chuckle, but a moment later he asks if the guard is serious. The guard explains that they did not receive orders to disembark the players. He continues to speak when Mr. Orange storms towards the nearest truck, ripping back its tarpaulin to see Steve, Lakshmi, Johnny, and player 127 all sat anxiously within. Mr. Yellow and Miss Green watch as Mr. Orange paces back to the guard and asks what kind of special idiot he is. The guard stutters to respond until Mr. Orange punches him across the face, knocking him to the ground. Mr. Orange shouts at the guard that he could have told them before they started having a game chat in earshot of the players. Now painfully feeling his head on the ground, the guard protests, but Mr. Orange takes out a gun. He shoots the guard in the head. This causes several listening players to sit up in fear or disbelief, whilst Mr. Yellow takes in an impatient breath. Within a minute, the triangle guards enter the building before them. Some other circle guards are heard hurrying to clear the body of the murdered circle guard, and Johnny pulls back the tarpaulin of his truck, yet he is almost immediately shouted at to close it and stay in his truck. After a few more minutes of nervous waiting, the all clear is heard on the circle guards' radios. The first three trucks are emptied. While each set of players are swiftly escorted ahead into the entrance of the building, the majority find themselves looking up in awe at its sheer height. Nicholas, Kelly, Charlie, and player 200 listen to the other players' reactions, until their truck's tarpaulin flies up and they are ordered out. Player 200 finds herself mesmerised by the sight and height of this building. Kelly, on the other hand, gulps and seems to have trouble breathing, but Charlie whispers that Scott would want her to give her best. He pats her on the back and leads the way to the entrance. Nicholas calmly follows behind them. Once inside the building, these four players are led down a corridor, then through a battered door into a darkened room. The only stimuli they sense in this room are the echoed whispers of the other players, along with the light reflected from the guards' masks and guns. While Charlie is carefully led by a circle guard to his position on the lower right side of the room, Lakshmi is heard higher up the right side, tearfully begging her guard to let her go home. This triggers a wave of further whispers on both sides of the room, which soon breaks into a flurry of hysteria. Moments later, a guard's voice suddenly booms out, ordering silence. This order is immediately followed, and an encompassing ring of lights illuminates the lightly coloured room. Now visible is a plethora of circular podiums, arranged in coloured rows, across a space of 10 metres in both length and width. On both sides of the room are monochromatic platforms, which stand at an equal height to the podiums. The 16 players are placed evenly along these platforms, with 8 on each side of the room, alternating between male and female. While the players look ahead to the coloured podiums with a mixture of wonder, fear, and every emotion between, The guards behind them remain still, holding their guns at the ready. The layout of the room is symmetrical. Before each side platform is a row of 10 yellow podiums. Lined up directly behind these 10 yellow podiums are 10 red podiums. Moving into the centre of the room is a row of blue podiums. However, unlike the 2 rows before, there are only 8 blue podiums, without the outer podiums from the previous rows. Adjacent to the row of blue podiums is a row of 8 green podiums. Closer to the centre of the room are 6 more yellow podiums, without the outer podiums from before. Beyond them are 6 red podiums, followed by just 4 blue podiums, then 4 green podiums. This therefore creates a shape resembling a bow tie from above. In fact, the 4 green podiums of each side are placed next to each other at the centre of the room, which forms a rectangle of 8 green podiums. As players examine the space, Silver, player 71, who is stood at the highest end of the right side, shouts that they're playing Twister, which triggers a wave of desperate and horrified expressions. Silver then ponders how the spots are further apart here than they are on a normal board. Richard, player 14, is stood across from her, at the highest end of the left side. He begins to shout something about himself, but stops and turns abruptly to the nearest guard, addressing her and the other guards as forking duckheads. This guard turns off the safety to her gun and points it into Richard's abdomen. She reminds him that she is a Christian lady and will not tolerate this sort of language. Richard glares straight at her mask, yet turns back round with a huff. 2 spots away on the other side of Tracy, player 26, Alan, player 23, lets out a sneeze, then smirks as he looks back ahead. Stood halfway down the right side, player 200 removes a scrunchie from her pocket and ties up her large perm. She takes a step forward and looks over the edge of the platform to see a drop of approximately 5 metres before the yellow podiums, which is consistent across the whole board. Player 200 proceeds to look up to the dark abyss above these podiums. She is then distracted by a confused gasp to the left, and looks over to see Kelly, player 189, on the other side of Nicholas, player 173. Kelly is staring at the large screen, which is just activated on the upper side of the room. Within the top section of the screen is a count of the players remaining, and the prize fund, which stands at 16 and £13,500,000 respectively. Below this are the words female players on the left and male players on the right, although most of the screen beneath remains empty. Diane, player 96, is stood on the room's left side, next to Alan. She appears to be processing these words, and quietly asks why the screen mentions males and females, as they have not seen this before. Steve, player 98, who is stood on Diane's other side, shakes his head, and says he has no idea. He instinctively takes her hand, which she grips in return, before turning back to the rest of the room. Speakers in each of the 4 corners activate with a high-pitched chime, making some players jump, wince, or cover their ears. Miss Green's voice welcomes the players to Game 5, Twister. The confirmation of this game is met with a range of mainly negative reactions. Once silence has resumed, Miss Green explains how, just like regular Twister, players will be ordered to move their hands or feet to podiums of a certain colour. She reveals, however, that unlike regular Twister, orders will not be given to the whole group, or even individually, but to each gender. Some players appear perplexed, and Miss Green informs that they will be given 10 seconds to follow their gender's order. If a player has not completed this order in time, they will be eliminated. Richard grinds his teeth in sullen thought, as Miss Green explains how only one player may touch a podium at any time, and they may not touch a podium with any other part of their body, including their elbows, knees, or buttocks. Several wary looks are shared between players, as Miss Green clarifies that a player may not remove their hands or feet from a podium once it has been touched. Mr. Yellow jumps in and informs how players are also forbidden from deliberately pushing each other off the podiums. With an impatient twang, Miss Green's voice is heard insisting that she was about to say this. The tension amongst players is briefly interrupted by a moment of amusement, and player 53, the blonde woman with the blonde quiff and chunky glasses, sniggers from the lowest end of the room's left side. Once players are quiet again, Miss Green asks if there are any questions. Only Johnny, player 123, who is stood next to player 53, raises his hand. He breathes out and asks how many of them are actually going to live through this game. This prompts a range of uncomfortable reactions, and Lakshmi, player 148, is heard sobbing that she does not care about the money, but just wants to go home and see her mother. Mr. Orange's voice is then heard, answering to Johnny how he will have to live long enough to find out. Kelly, who is stood opposite Johnny, turns away and whispers that she is going to puke. Yet Charlie, player 191, who is stood next to her at the lowest end of this side, orders her to face back to the front. Kelly slowly follows this order, and Charlie gives her a nod of encouragement. Nicholas, who is stood on Kelly's other side, hears this exchange, but eyes the podiums ahead. During this time, the Triangle Guards are sat together in a gallery, full of controls, buttons and screens, although this room overlooks nothing but a dark space. Miss Green examines the camera feeds, which currently display most players' nervous demeanours. Tracy is stopping herself from trembling, and Richard's skin has turned pale. On the other hand, Johnny is stretching his muscles, and Silver seems to be performing breathing exercises. After finishing reading Charlie's page in his player booklet, Mr. Yellow looks up to the screens. He lets out a deep breath, then voices his surprise at the number of women who are still alive. Miss Green twists her chair towards Mr. Yellow and responds that he can leave that sexist shirt in the past, adding how the girls have proved themselves to be just as strong as the men. Mr. Yellow replies that he is not disputing their skill or resilience, and begins to explain himself, but stops short and says he did not mean to offend Miss Green. She seems ready to argue further, when Mr. Orange lets out a chuckle and asks if they should just get on with it. Mr. Yellow nods, and following the reluctant approval of Miss Green, the all clear is given. Back at the Twister board, several hesitant conversations have restarted, yet player 127, the older West African man, is now praying on his knees. Miss Green's voice pierces through the chatter, announcing that the game will now begin. Silence falls over the room, and all players, including player 127, step forward to stand before the board. The words female players brighten on the screen, with male players becoming dull against the dark background. A pixelated spinner board appears beneath female players, and an arrow begins to spin round and round the different colours. Kelly subtly gulps, and Diane maintains an unwavering gaze towards the screen, until the arrow comes to a stop on right foot yellow. Miss Green announces this order from the speaker, and next to the spinner board on the screen, a timer suddenly appears. As it begins to count down from 10 seconds, player 35, the woman with gaping eyes and a smattering of tattoos, becomes the first woman to shove her right foot down on the yellow podium before her. Within seconds, all the other women have followed suit. Player 53, the woman with the blonde quiff and chunky glasses, looks around with a determined stare. A tear flows down Lakshmi's cheek as she glances to the surrounding floor below, but she wipes away this tear and forces herself to look back up. The remaining 5 seconds count themselves down in silence. Colin, player 37, nervously grins round to the other players and wistfully jokes that he hopes the whole game will be this easy. This produces a very limited set of laughs, and player 200 gives a light shake of the head. After hitting 0, the timer and spinner both disappear from the screen. The words male players then activate on the screen's right side, and the arrow starts spinning through the coloured spots beneath these words. Despite standing at the top of the board, Richard finds himself squinting at the screen, and a grimace soon forms across his face. Tensing his fists, Nicholas focuses on the column of empty podiums ahead of him, between player 200 and Kelly. The arrow slows down and lands on left foot yellow, which triggers some quiet sounds of relief from several male players. Before Mr. Orange has even finished repeating this order, 7 of the men have already placed their left feet on the yellow podiums. However, player 127, the older West African man, cringes when he slowly places down his foot on the nearest yellow podium. He holds his knee, and Silver carefully observes his painful expression as the remaining time counts down. The timer hits 0, and Alan and Diane face each other, with 1 foot each on neighbouring podiums. Alan wipes the sweat from his brow and shoots Diane a cautious smile. He then looks to Tracy, who has her back to him on the other neighbouring podiums. In the gallery, Mr. Orange remarks how it was his idea to move 23 between those 2 birds, and they will get to see if he stays loyal to either of them. He adds, however, that he is more looking forward to this one. Mr. Yellow turns back to see Mr. Orange pointing at another screen, which shows Johnny and player 35 looking equally displeased to be placed next to one another. Miss Green turns to the screen and watches for a second. Mr. Yellow begins to discuss the conflict between these players when she cuts him off, affirming that she is about to give the next order for the girls. Before Mr. Yellow could say anything, Miss Green presses the button for left foot red. Back at the Twister board, players remain in place, each with 1 foot on the side platform and the other foot on a yellow podium. The spinner subsequently appears beneath female players, and the arrow hurtles through the colours, carefully followed by the players' eyes. Although most players are now more focused on the screen instead of each other, player 35 is staring straight towards Steve. He eventually looks up to meet player 35's large eyes and gives a quick, uneasy smile before turning to Diane and whispering to get ready. The spinner then comes to a stop on left foot red. Whilst Miss Green voices the order, 7 of the women put their left feet on the red podiums directly ahead of their right feet. With 8 seconds left, player 35 is about to put her left foot on the red podium ahead, but she suddenly holds back. Player 53 watches with cautious intrigue as player 35 grins to Johnny, then turns and puts her left foot on the red podium before his left foot, thereby limiting his range of movement. While several players look over with apprehension, player 35 glares at Johnny and coldly states that she knows it was him who took her bacon sandwich this morning. Steve and player 53 both watch in disbelief as the countdown reaches 0. Johnny does not meet the vengeful gaze of player 35, but calmly focuses on the podiums behind her. In the gallery, Mr. Orange claps with Schadenfreude and cheers that this is why he wanted these two together. Miss Green turns to him, conceding how he was correct about this one, and now they can finally have it out. Mr. Orange eyes the buttons and excitedly suggests they start having some fun. He is about to press right foot green when Mr. Yellow jumps in, arguing how unfair this would be to the male players. Mr. Orange slowly turns to Mr. Yellow, who reasons that it is best to save this sort of move for later, when a few have dropped out. Mr. Orange huffs out, but sighs, "Fine," and chooses right foot red instead. With the next order for male players now imminent, the centre of attention is upon player 35 and Johnny. The arrow begins to spin round the board. Player 35's smiling eyes attempt to penetrate those of Johnny, but he remains focused upon the screen's spinning arrow until it eventually stops on right foot red. Richard looks ahead to the row of green podiums and gasps in disbelief, although when he notices the other male players putting their right feet on the row of red podiums, he lets out a subtle sigh of relief. Whilst Richard follows the other male players' example, player 127, the older West African man, looks helplessly across the board. Despite clearly being unwilling to put weight on his left knee, player 127 manages to shove his right leg over, and his foot slides to a rest on the red podium ahead. When the countdown passes through 7 seconds, Johnny realizes that the only red podium remaining is diagonally across from him, behind player 35. She continues ogling Johnny as he gently turns on his left leg, rotating his right foot towards her. He finally looks back up to her, and a grin appears on his face, revealing his braced teeth. With just 3 seconds left, all players watch as Johnny slowly leans down on his left foot, preparing to move his right foot through the narrow arch of player 35's legs. The smile on her face vanishes. Still leaning down, Johnny lunges his right leg across, making player 35 flinch when his foot passes through her legs and reaches the red podium. Without delay, he squats himself down even lower, so that his shoulder is nearly making contact with her groin. Player 35 remains still, but she is clearly anxious and aware of the vulnerable position in which she now finds herself. Richard turns round and shouts to stand up and knock the bitch off. Player 35 suddenly gasps, then begs Johnny not to push her off. Still with his shoulder beneath player 35's groin, Johnny glances up to her with a determined expression. He proceeds to roll his shoulders around in their sockets, and player 35's breathing quickens until she splutters that she's sorry. The other players remain transfixed as Johnny smirks, and player 35 promises to give him all her food if he lets her live. Without speaking, Johnny rises a few inches from his squatting position, which causes player 35 to yelp when her left foot is lifted onto its toes. In the gallery, Mr. Yellow declares that it's time to continue, and he asks Miss Green to give the next order. However, she snaps at him to let this play out, before wheeling her chair over to Mr. Orange. Together they watch this screen, and he whispers how that one is dull as sin. Miss Green chuckles and quietly agrees. Meanwhile, on the twister board, Johnny rises further from his squatting position, which almost forces player 35 off her feet, and her pleas become more desperate. Player 53 finds herself crouching cautiously on the other side of Johnny. Diane whispers to Steve to be careful and takes his hand. He continues looking round to player 35 and Johnny, but squeezes Diane's hand in return. With Johnny's shoulder nestled firmly beneath her groin, player 35 is almost balancing on her toes, until she bursts into tears, begging him to have mercy. Richard shouts to do it, although Lakshmi also begins to cry on the other side of the board, and shouts at Johnny to stop. Various players look round with a mixture of emotions, at which point Johnny looks up into player 35's eyes and states, "You've changed." He turns to the guards, then voices how he is risking falling off in this position and has no other option than to do this. Player 35 lets out a high-pitched scream as Johnny rises from his squatting position. Despite trying to grab onto him, she is lifted from her feet and into the air. Other players watch, most quietly aghast, to see player 35 fall back, smacking the back of her head on a green podium 2 rows ahead. Gasps are heard all around as she falls between the podiums and hits the ground below. Lakshmi's crying intensifies and Kelly shudders, but Charlie whispers round to the latter not to move. A cracking cry sounds from the rusty floor below, followed by the sound of a door opening on this level. Player 35 gasps for help from a set of approaching footsteps, whimpering that she's bleeding. Players on this side of the room look down in disbelief as the outline of a guard approaches player 35 within the darkness beneath. After the echoing click of a gun, she cries and begins to complain that she was pushed, when a shot blasts out, making several players tremble. Diane's right foot moves back, and she treads near the edge of the podium, but Steve grips onto her jacket, stopping her from moving further. Whilst the footsteps of the guard below return through the door they came from, Mr. Orange announces from the speakers that player 35 is eliminated. On the screen, the number of players remaining decreases to 15, whilst the prize fund increases to £13,600,000. Johnny cracks his tattooed neck and looks across the board to see Kelly and Lakshmi glaring back at him. The spinner appears on the screen beneath female players, but before the arrow has a chance to spin, Johnny declares that Crazy Eyes was trying to kill him too. Nobody really reacts, and the arrow begins spinning for the female players. Lakshmi fights back her tears and inhales, yet Colin turns to her and whispers reassuringly. The arrow then lands on left foot blue. The 7 surviving women each move their left feet from the red podiums to the blue podiums directly ahead with relative ease. After the countdown reaches 0, the arrow spins for the male players and lands on right hand red. Amidst a quiet murmur of relief, the countdown begins from 10 seconds. The men all lean down to place their right hands on the red podiums ahead of their right feet, which have just been used by the female players. Johnny, on the other hand, leans back to place his right hand on the red podium behind his right foot. In the gallery, Miss Green and Mr. Orange are still sat next to each other, watching this interaction on a screen. Miss Green giggles that she told Mr. Orange it would be a good idea to place the Toff and Scouser together. Mr. Orange holds up his hands and admits she was right about this one. Diane then whispers something to Steve, and while Miss Green tries to decipher what is being said, Mr. Orange leans in and puts his gloved hand on top of hers. Mr. Yellow watches from the other side of the gallery as Miss Green slowly turns to meet Mr. Orange's gaze. After a silent moment, she begins rubbing her thumb against his little finger. At this moment, player 127 is still leaning his right arm forwards like the other male players, but he is now struggling to maintain this position. With a dull wince, he begins to complain that his knee and back are both aching. While Lakshmi urges player 127 to hold on, Silver gently turns her body and peers round. Her eyes widen when she sees player 127's legs shaking on the podiums directly behind her. She shoots a concerned look to the nearest guard until player 127 lets out a painful grunt and mutters, "I beg." He painfully pushes up from his right arm, barely keeping his hand attached to the red podium. The nearest guard readies her gun, and player 127 struggles to balance himself. A second later, his right leg gives way, and he lets out a desperate cry as he tumbles back to the right. Silver squeals and lifts her foot from the blue podium, narrowly avoiding player 127's hand when he falls between the podiums. Silver gasps and rebalances herself on the podiums, but the guard who previously took out the gun for player 127 turns it towards her. She slowly notices, and with an alarmed expression, asks the guard what he's doing. Player 127 is shot on the ground below and announced to be eliminated. Continuing to glare at the guard's gun, Silver protests how she had to move or the old man would have taken her with him. However, the guard maintains that she broke the rules by moving from the podiums. A click sounds as he turns off his gun's safety. Mr. Yellow hurries to activate his microphone, then he calmly orders all guards to stand down and await further instructions. After watching this order being obeyed on the screens, Mr. Orange insists that this one broke the rules, and he had enough of her even before today began. However, Mr. Yellow argues back how she had to jump or she could have been pulled down. Mr. Orange falters, and Mr. Yellow asks if he would not have done the same in her position. Mr. Orange retorts that he would not be in her position. Mr. Yellow laughs very quietly, and begins to respond, but stops himself and continues to defend Silver's choice. With tensely opened eyes, Silver continues to stare at the guard's gun and finds herself grabbing, almost pulling the split ends of her frayed black hair as she awaits a verdict. A few seconds later, Mr. Orange's voice sounds from the speakers, announcing that this was a legal move. He subsequently orders for the game to continue. Silver brings her hands down to her face as she lets out some tears of relief, yet Richard rolled his eyes from across the board. However, before the next order is given to female players, Mr. Orange's voice is heard, asking in a somewhat mocking tone if it is not time to ramp things up. Players look around to each other with worry and bewilderment, until Miss Green's voice is heard responding that she could not agree more. Looking ahead to Steve, Diane frowns and asks the nearest guard what's going on. He ignores her question, and within seconds, all guards step back to stand against the side walls. A few podiums over, Tracy slowly looks up to the dark space above, then swears under her breath. A technical grinding suddenly sounds from beneath every podium, which causes some players to jump and others to become even more anxious. Several players ask what is happening, with player 53 and Richard shouting the loudest, although they receive no response. The poles beneath the podiums begin to extend upwards, forcing them to rise. The shouting swiftly accelerates into a cacophony of confusion and protest, although all players remain fixed in their squatting or crouched positions. The podiums continue to rise, and over the ongoing din, Kelly is heard crying that she does not like this, whilst Richard yells how he is fucking scared of heights and orders for them to be put back down. However, the podiums persist upwards. Unfastened hair and open tracksuit tops begin to whip about through the downward rushes of air. Lights activate on the surrounding walls, reilluminating the players every few seconds. A chorus of panic and hysteria continues to accompany each sudden burst of light, with several players now crying or struggling to breathe. Yet they all stay in their positions, and many begin to grip their fingers and toes to the podiums with all the strength they appear to possess. With the ground below becoming further away, Silver screams and desperately tries to keep her long black hair from lashing at her face. On the other side of the board, Tracy is suffering from the same issue, but she clamps her hair in her hands and grips her feet into the podiums. With eyes defiantly closed, she seems to allow herself to become distracted by the sound of Richard's wild screaming. Still surging upwards, many players find themselves trembling at the dizzying heights and ongoing flashes of wall lights. Diane lets out a nervous whimper, and her knees become unsteady. Over the whoosh of air, Steve yells at her not to move, but after just 2 seconds, she tips forward and lets out a piercing scream. Steve gasps in terror, although Diane manages to grasp her right hand towards him. He maintains his position and thrusts his left hand up to grab her by the throat. This appears to choke Diane a little, but supports her from falling. She uses this support to regain her balance and continues to breathe out in horror as her long hair whips ruthlessly across her face. Still rising to the ceiling, Diane looks beyond Steve to see the chunky glasses of player 53 falling from her nose. She swipes her hand to grab them, but the downward rush of air steals them from her grasp. Behind Diane, Alan's breathing intensifies, and he feels his sweating right hand on the red podium begin to move forward by itself. He winces and lets out a terrified mumble until his hand gives way. Alan gasps and shoves down his forearm, which helps him grip his hand over the side of the podium. He coughs violently, yet forces himself to stay still, without letting his elbow touch the podium. In the opposite corner of the board, Nicholas glares at Kelly, who is steadying herself with one hand and using the other to control some, but not all of her ginger curls, the rest of which are flapping aimlessly about her face. The podium's ascent does not relent, and over the ongoing rush of air, Kelly is heard emitting several horrified squeaks. Charlie looks back and shouts to stop panicking. The podiums then begin decelerating towards the brightly lit summit of this vertical tunnel. A few podiums behind Kelly, Lakshmi maintains her squatting stance, with her thumbs in her ears and her other fingers wrapped over her eyes. While the podium's mechanical grinding and the ongoing rushing sound of air both subside, Lakshmi removes her shaking hands from over her face. Her eyeline slowly descends into the dark space below, and after a few seconds, she lets out an unearthly grunt. Colin looks back to the origin of this grunt, and with a loud yet reassuring tone, he advises Lakshmi not to look down. However, most of her body begins to tremble as she mumbles in Hindi. Although the podiums are now ascending at an even slower speed, the volume and instability in Lakshmi's voice increase. Several other players look over to see her in a state of terrified hypnosis. Her shaking eyes are fixed to the ground, and she produces a sudden, hair-raising yelp. Other players watch in discomfort as Lakshmi's unintelligible pleas become louder. Colin calls to her, but her body rattles in an uneven pattern when she looks back down to the ground. He continues to observe her, and his supported expression gradually turns to that of resigned acceptance. Lakshmi's eyes roll to the left, and without appearing to do so voluntarily, she finds herself stepping back a right foot from the podium. Lakshmi wails quietly and falls towards Colin. He shouts in a panic, but manages to lean far enough to the right to narrowly avoid her flailing arm and cascading plaits. Even though the brightly lit summit of the building is now in sight above, most players are captivated, many in a state of shock. They watch Lakshmi fall through the coloured hue of the podiums, then disappear into the darkness beneath. Colin quietly swears, and a few seconds later, a high-pitched scream echoes up from below, until it is truncated by an abrupt thud. Whilst the podiums slowly rise through the last few meters, players notice the screen at the lower end of the podium. It now shows that 13 of them remain, with a prize fund of £13,800,000. Almost all players are still clearly shaken, with several taking deep breaths or attempting to assure themselves. The podiums finally come to a stop, just meters from the ceiling above. At the top end of the room, the 3 triangle guards are sat behind clear glass windows in the overlooking control gallery. Players gradually turn in this direction, and several stare or glare at the guards, until Kelly shrieks towards the right side wall. Most players look over towards a large gun which juts out from this wall. Surely enough, those on the left side notice a large gun on their side wall as well. Keeping his right hand firmly in place on the red podium, Alan coughs out from the depths of his lungs, then uses his free hand to wipe his t-shirt against his sweaty forehead. Johnny looks round at the side walls, and with a dry tone, comments that now they all know how Bruce Willis felt during Die Hard. This is ignored by most players, who are still trying to keep themselves calm at this new height. However, Miss Green laughs within the gallery. Mr. Orange leans over and takes his microphone. His voice sounds from the surrounding speakers, announcing that player 148 is eliminated. Most players listen in silence, except for Richard, who looks to the ceiling and persistently whispers to himself not to look down. The words female players then activate on the screen, and Miss Green takes her microphone. With a relaxed yet merry tone, she asks who's ready for another spin.